the most expensive, sophisticated, and layered air defense architecture in the history of modern warfare, a system designed to be the impenetrable shield of a nation, failed to stop a single projectile. It was not a barrage that overwhelmed the sensors through sheer volume. It was not a surprise attack from an unknown vector. It was a single, calculated strike that bypassed 10 separate interceptors, turning a fortified command bunker into a tomb for 7 senior military strategists. This was not just a failure of machinery, it was the abrupt end of a decades-long assumption about safety, deterrence, and the technological gap between perceived superpowers and their adversaries. When the dust settled on the fortified structure, the reality that emerged was one that military planners in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Beijing have arguably feared more than nuclear escalation. The physics of defense have officially been broken. Welcome back to the Global Brief. I am your host, Zayne. Today, we are dissecting an event that has fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement for the 21st century. We are analyzing the hypersonic strike that neutralized a critical regional command node, the technological leap that allowed it to happen, and why the vice president of one of the world's most advanced defense contractors is now publicly admitting that our current defensive systems are obsolete. We need to talk about the B-2, the collapse of the interception timeline, and what happens to the global order when the shield can no longer stop the spear. To understand the gravity of this situation, we have to look beyond the headlines of casualties and look at the structural capability that was dismantled. 7 senior officers are gone. These were not infantrymen on the front lines exposed to the chaos of urban combat. These were the architects of the war itself, individuals sitting in what was supposed to be the safest room in the entire theater of operations. They were housed in a fortified command center, a structure built with reinforced concrete and buried beneath layers of earth, protected by a point defense architecture that costs billions of dollars to maintain. This facility was the nerve center for regional operations, a place where the decisions that dictate the flow of the war are made. The assumption was that while soldiers are vulnerable, the command structure is immune. That immunity evaporated in a fraction of a second. The weapon responsible for this paradigm shift, the B-2, did not just damage the facility, it devastated it. This distinction in language is crucial. In military assessments, damage implies that operations can continue after repairs. Devastation implies a total loss of function. Israeli military officials, who are typically extremely reserved and careful with their public assessments during active conflict, are using terminology that suggests a catastrophic failure of protection. The strike has altered the operational picture in a way that cannot be managed through standard contingency plans. When you lose 7 senior commanders in a single strike, you are not just losing personnel. You are losing the institutional memory, the specific operational relationships, and the real-time situational awareness that takes years to build. What makes this event terrifying for defense analysts is not just the result, but the method. 10 interceptors were fired at this incoming threat. 10 highly advanced, radar-guided defensive missiles were launched to neutralize a single incoming target. In a standard ballistic engagement, the probability of kill for that many interceptors against one target should be near absolute. Yet, the B-2 evaded all of them. It did not just outrun them, it outmaneuvered them. It reached the command center untouched and delivered its payload with a level of precision that shouldn't be possible at hypersonic speeds. This has exposed a gap between the defensive systems the West has been selling to the world and the offensive engineering that Iran has been quietly perfecting. This gap was highlighted in a moment of shocking candor by the vice president of Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, the very company responsible for developing the backbone of Israel's missile defense. In a statement that has since rippled through every defense ministry on the planet, he compared the current state of missile defense against hypersonic threats to a single basketball player trying to guard a legend like LeBron James. It was an admission that the system is broken. He stated plainly that we have entered a new era of air defense, one where the interceptors we rely on are trying to solve a physics problem, that the incoming missiles have already evolved past. Before we go deeper into the technical breakdown of how this happened, I want to take a brief moment to address the broader context. We are living through a period of converging crises: economic instability, geopolitical escalation, and technological disruption. Identifying these patterns before they impact your portfolio or your safety is critical. I have compiled my research on these recurring warning signs into a report called the Global Crisis Survival Guide. It breaks down how to navigate these systemic shocks. If you want to understand the macro trends shaping this volatility, you can find the report linked in the description. Now let's get back to the physics of this strike. We need to clarify what the Fatah-2 actually is, because there is a misconception that it is simply a faster version of the missiles we saw earlier in the conflict. That is incorrect. The difference between the first generation of hypersonic weapons and this second iteration is the difference between a stone thrown by a catapult and a guided drone. The Fatah-1, announced in 2023, was a formidable weapon that utilized a hypersonic glide trajectory. It would boost to altitude via a ballistic stage and then glide through the atmosphere at Mach 15. This depressed trajectory kept it below the engagement envelope of high-altitude exo-atmospheric interceptors, like the Arrow 3, while moving too fast for lower-tier systems to track effectively. It was a brute force solution to the problem of missile defense. The Fatah-2 is a different animal entirely. It represents a generational leap in guidance technology. The primary challenge of hypersonic flight is not speed, it is communication. When an object travels through the atmosphere at Mach 15, roughly 2 miles per second, the friction with the air is so intense that it turns the air around the missile into plasma. This is a layer of superheated ionized gas. This plasma sheath acts like a Faraday cage, blocking radio frequency signals. This means that traditional GPS guidance, command uplinks from ground stations, and onboard radar seekers go blind. They cannot send or receive data through the plasma. For years, Western defense planners assumed that this was the Achilles heel of hypersonic weapons, that they would be inaccurate in their terminal phase because they couldn't see where they were going. Iranian engineers appear to have solved this problem. The Fatah-2 utilizes a guidance architecture that operates independently of radio frequencies during that critical plasma phase. It uses a combination of advanced inertial navigation, which measures the missile's movement internally, and, crucially, optical terminal guidance. This means the missile has a camera or sensor that can see the target visually. It does not need a radar ping. It recognizes the physical profile of the target structure. By switching to optical guidance, the missile renders the plasma sheath irrelevant to its targeting capabilities. It flies at Mach 15, maneuvers erratically to throw off interceptors, and then uses its optical eyes to lock onto the specific building it was programmed to destroy. This precision is what changes the strategic calculus. We are not talking about hitting a military base. We are talking about hitting a specific hardened bunker within a base. The strike killed 7 senior officers because the weapon was accurate enough to penetrate the exact point of the facility where they were located. This level of accuracy, combined with hypersonic speed, creates a threat profile that current defensive systems were simply not designed to handle. This brings us to the physics of why 10 interceptors failed. It is essential to understand that this was not a failure of the operators or a malfunction of the equipment. It was a failure of the math. To intercept a missile, a defensive system must complete a complex chain of events. First, it must detect the threat. Second, it must calculate where that threat will be in the future. Third, it must launch an interceptor to meet the threat at that future point. And fourth, the interceptor must maneuver in the final seconds to ensure a direct hit or a proximity detonation. Hypersonic weapons break this chain at every single link. Let's start with detection. A missile moving at Mach 15 covers distance so rapidly that the reaction window shrinks to near zero. From the moment a radar achieves a high-quality track on a target like the Fatah-2, the time until impact can be less than 70 seconds for a target 200 kilometers away. Now, consider the defensive timeline. The Arrow system, or similar advanced interceptors, takes between 55 and 65 seconds to go from lock-on to launch to intercept altitude. The margin for error is measured in single-digit seconds. If there is any delay in processing, any degradation in radar performance due to atmospheric conditions, or any hesitation in the decision-making loop, the window closes. The missile hits the target before the interceptor can get there. But the problem gets worse. The Fata-2 is not flying in a predictable ballistic arc like a Scud missile from the 1990s. It is maneuvering. It is changing its heading and altitude while flying at hypersonic speeds. Every time the Fata-2 maneuvers, the defensive system has to throw out its previous calculation and start over. It has to predict a new intercept point. By the time the computer calculates the new path and sends the data to the interceptor, the Fata-2 has moved again. The interceptor is constantly chasing a ghost, flying toward a location where the target used to be, not where it is. This is the LeBron James analogy in action. The defense knows where the attacker is right now, but by the time they move to block him, he has already changed direction and driven to the hoop. 10 interceptors were launched, and in 10 separate instances, they arrived at empty air because the target was faster and more agile than the solution calculated to stop it. The terminal phase is the final nail in the coffin. Because the Fata-2 uses optical guidance, it is actively steering itself toward the target in the final seconds of flight. It is making micro-corrections at speeds that defensive interceptors simply cannot match structurally. An interceptor missile is designed to maneuver against ballistic threats or aircraft, which have specific speed limits and turn radiuses. Trying to hit a hypersonic glide vehicle that is actively dodging is like trying to shoot a bullet out of the air with another bullet, while the first bullet is swerving. The 10 interceptors fired were sophisticated, expensive pieces of hardware, but they were rendered useless by the kinetic reality of the engagement. The implications of this strike extend far beyond the loss of the command center itself. We have to look at how Israeli military command is structured to understand the severity of this blow. The doctrine of command survivability has been standard since the mid-20th century. Disperse your authority, protect your critical nodes, and ensure redundancy so that if one center is hit, the network survives. The facility struck today was a regional operational command center. It was responsible for a specific geographic sector, coordinating strikes, managing intelligence, and liaising with allied forces. The 7 officers killed were the brain trust for that specific sector. When you remove 7 key decision-makers instantly, the command network does not collapse entirely, but it suffers a severe stroke. The specific operations those officers were managing, the strike packages being planned, the delicate coordination with Gulf partners, the intelligence being processed, are all disrupted. The threads of command are severed. Yes, other officers can step in. But the depth of the bench is not infinite. The replacements do not have the specific institutional knowledge or the personal relationships that the deceased officers possessed. The efficiency of the war effort drops. There is friction in the system. Orders take longer to process, intelligence is misinterpreted, coordination becomes clunky. Even more damaging is the psychological impact on the remaining command structure. Every officer sitting in a bunker in Tel Aviv in the north or near the Gaza border now knows a terrifying truth. The concrete above their heads and the interceptors stationed outside cannot guarantee their safety. Yesterday they operated under the assumption that they were secure. Today, they have to calculate the probability that they are the next target. This introduces a cognitive load that degrades performance. It changes behavior. Officers might spend less time in fixed positions, relying on mobile communications that are less secure and harder to coordinate. It creates paranoia within the ranks, forcing them to question how the enemy knew exactly where to strike and when. This brings us to the intelligence failure, which is perhaps as significant as the defensive failure. How did Iran know? A fortified classified command center is not listed on public maps. Its location is a state secret. The presence of 7 senior officers at a specific time is highly sensitive information known only to a select few. Yet the targeting was precise. Iran did not waste a strategic asset like the Fatah-2 on a guess. They knew the location, they knew the function, and they knew the personnel density was high enough to justify the cost of the weapon. This implies a level of intelligence penetration that is deeply unsettling for Israeli counterintelligence services. It suggests that there are leaks, either human or cyber, that are providing real-time targeting data on the most sensitive facilities in the country. The domestic political fallout in Israel is likely to be severe. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been managing this war as a political asset, presenting himself as the guarantor of security. A strike that kills 7 senior officers in a protected bunker shatters that narrative. It provides ammunition to his critics and creates a powerful new constituency of grieving families who demand answers about why the billions spent on defense failed to protect their loved ones. This comes at a time when the government is already under immense pressure regarding the expansion of ground operations in Lebanon. Widening a war while your command infrastructure is proving vulnerable is a difficult strategy to sell to a skeptical public. We must also consider the international reaction, specifically from the major powers watching this conflict from the sidelines. Russia's response has been heavily analytical. The Russian Ministry of Defense has been developing its own hypersonic doctrines for over a decade, with weapons like the Avangard and the Zircon. For them, the Fatah-2 strike is a live-fire validation of their own theories. They observed the optical terminal guidance navigating the plasma sheath and saw it as a parallel solution to their own engineering challenges. Russia is essentially taking notes, using this conflict as a testing ground to verify that Western air defenses, the same ones deployed by NATO in Poland and Romania, are vulnerable to hypersonic maneuvering. China's reaction is arguably even more significant for the global balance of power. During this conflict, a research paper was published in a Chinese peer-reviewed defense journal, Tactical Missile Technology. This paper theoretically predicted exactly what happened today. It argued that the speed and flight profile of hypersonic weapons render existing American and Western defense systems ineffective. It specifically noted that even if an interceptor manages a collision, the kinetic energy of the hypersonic weapon is so massive that it might still reach the target and destroy it purely through mass and velocity. The Fatah-2 strike provided the empirical data to back up that Chinese theory. For the People's Liberation Army, this is proof of concept. They are looking at the U.S. presence in the Pacific, at the hardened command centers in Guam, Japan, and South Korea, and seeing them as vulnerable. The assumptions that protect American power projection in the Indo-Pacific are being eroded by the data coming out of the Middle East. If a regional power like Iran can penetrate the most advanced defenses money can buy, what can a superpower like China do with vastly more resources and industrial capacity? This brings us to the concept of the kinetic energy problem, a detail often overlooked in mainstream analysis. The Chinese paper touched on this, and it is vital. Traditional missile defense relies on the interceptor destroying the incoming warhead, usually through a fragmentation blast. But when a weapon is moving at Mach 15, it possesses an enormous amount of kinetic energy. Even if you damage the guidance system or the propulsion 3 seconds before impact, the missile is essentially a giant, super-fast bullet. It doesn't need guidance anymore. Its momentum alone will carry it through the target. The reinforced concrete of a bunker might stop an explosion, but stopping a dense object moving at hypersonic speeds requires a different level of physics that current bunkers are not built to withstand. So, what does this mean for the future of the conflict? We have to ask if this is the turning point. For the last 20 days, we have seen a symmetrical exchange of blows. Both sides have taken damage, but neither has delivered a knockout punch. The introduction of the Fatah-2 as a reliable precision weapon against command infrastructure changes the dynamic. It moves the conflict from a war of attrition to a war of decapitation. If Iran can selectively remove command nodes, they can degrade the Israeli military's ability to organize, respond, and adapt. The choice of target reveals Iran's strategy. They are not firing these expensive missiles at random. They are targeting the brain of the IDF. The Fatah II is a strategic reserve weapon. It is costly and difficult to manufacture in mass quantities. Using it to kill officers in a bunker signals that Iran is willing to trade financial resources for operational disruption. They are demonstrating that no place is safe. This forces the Israeli military to adapt by moving towards mobile command centers, dispersing leadership even further. While this increases survival chances, it drastically reduces operational efficiency. You cannot run a complex, multi-front war as effectively from the back of an armored carrier or a temporary shelter as you can from a dedicated command center with fiber optic links and massive server banks. This shift creates what military theorists call friction. Every decision becomes harder to make and harder to communicate. The delay between an order being given and an order being executed grows. In modern warfare, speed is everything. If the IDF's decision-making loop slows down because their commanders are constantly on the move to avoid hypersonic strikes, their advantage on the battlefield erodes. The enemy gets inside their decision cycle. This is the true cost of the 7 officers lost today. Not just the individuals, but the systemic paralysis that their deaths introduce into the machine. Let's zoom out to the financial implications, as this is the global brief. The cost asymmetry here is staggering. An interceptor missile for a system like Arrow or David's Sling can cost millions of dollars. A battery of 10 interceptors represents a massive investment of taxpayer money. If 10 of those investments fail to stop one offensive missile, the economic model of defense collapses. It becomes financially unsustainable to defend against cheap, effective hypersonic threats. We are seeing the cost-exchange ratio flip in favor of the offense. This is a nightmare for finance ministers and defense planners alike. It means that defense budgets will have to balloon just to maintain the status quo, or nations will have to accept a higher level of vulnerability. This event also signals a boom for the defense industry, but specifically for those developing directed energy weapons and next-generation tracking. The failure of kinetic interceptors, missiles hitting missiles, will drive investment into lasers and high-powered microwave systems, which engage at the speed of light and are not fooled by maneuvering. However, those technologies are years, perhaps decades, away from being fielded at a scale that can protect a whole country. In the interim, the gap remains. We also need to consider the ripple effects on the Gulf states. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have built their security architecture partially on the premise of Western and Israeli technological superiority. They rely on U.S.-supplied Patriot batteries and THAAD systems. Watching those systems, or their equivalents, fail against Iranian technology sends a chill through the royal courts of the Gulf. It forces a recalibration of alliances. If the Western shield is cracked, do they need to appease Iran diplomatically? Do they need to look to China for security guarantees? The strike on the bunker in Israel effectively destabilizes the entire diplomatic alignment of the Middle East. Furthermore, consider the impact on the American pilots and personnel in the region. U.S. forces coordinate closely with the IDF. The loss of those 7 officers means the loss of counterparts, people that American commanders knew and trusted. The friction we discussed earlier applies to joint operations as well. American strike packages, intelligence sharing, and logistics support all rely on a functioning Israeli command node. That node is now dark. Re-establishing those links takes time that in a hot war simply does not exist. As we look forward from this morning, the reality is stark. The doctrine of the fortified command center, which has stood for 30 years, has been tested and found insufficient. The concrete was thick enough for Scuds, but not for the Fatah II. The defense systems were smart enough for jets, but too slow for hypersonic glide vehicles. The gap between the era that ended this morning and the new era of defense is where the danger lies. We are currently living in that gap. The vice president of Rafael was right. It is a new era. The problem is that the LeBron James of missiles is on the court, and the defense is still trying to figure out the rules of the game. The officers who died paid the price for this lag in adaptation. And as long as the Fatah II remains in the inventory, with guidance that bypasses plasma, and targets that have been mapped by compromised intelligence, the threat remains existential. This is not about fear-mongering, it is about recognizing a shift in the fundamental variables of global security. The assumption of invulnerability is the most dangerous operational hazard of all. Today, that assumption was removed by force. The question now is not if the defense can catch up, but how much more damage will be sustained before it does. This is Zayne for the Global Brief. We will continue to monitor the fallout from this strike, the response from global markets, and the shifting strategies of the major powers involved. The situation is fluid, and the implications are just beginning to surface. Make sure you are subscribed to stay ahead of these developments. Thank you for watching.